Hi everyone, welcome to our Ask Me Anything Risk Management webinar. I'm just going to give everyone a few more moments to enter and then we'll get started. Perfect, so I think we'll dive into things. Welcome again everyone, we're thrilled to have you join us today for our risk management webinar. This is going to be a great interactive webinar, so we'll start by discussing how you can interact with us today. To do that, if you'd like to go to the next slide, Peter, please. Please type your questions into the written Q&A box, and they'll be selected for us for a response. Now, hopefully this won't happen today, but just in case we disappear due to any technical issues, stay right where you are, and we'll be back as soon as we can. Okay, so now we're going to go on to our agenda. Following instructions, today's agenda will be centered around a risk management presentation by Peter, and that's been designed around the questions we've received from you, the attendees, in advance. After that, you'll have the opportunity to ask Peter anything you like on medical device risk management through the Q&A chat box as mentioned earlier. I encourage you to post questions while Peter is presenting, as he'll respond to them as he discusses the various risk management topics. Please note that this webinar will focus on the topic of medical device risk management and not on how risk is managed in the Qualio platform. We received some questions specific to the Qualio tool, which I'll answer separately to the relevant participants in the coming days. I'd also ask that you keep the questions as generic as possible so that everybody attending benefits from the responses. Also, because we received so many questions in advance, we may not be able to get through all of them in our hour time frame, but fear not, Peter will be writing a blog post to cover the unanswered questions, and you'll receive a link to that in the near future. So let's move on to introductions. Hi everyone, I'm Lola. I am a senior quality specialist at Qualio with a keen interest in risk management. Before joining Qualio, I worked in quality and compliance roles in large multinationals and startups across Europe and North America, and I used my prior experience in EQMS implementation to work closely with customers in Qualio so that they achieve their quality goals and bring their product to the market efficiently. I am delighted today to be joined by Peter Sebelius, founder and head trainer of Medical Device HQ, which I'm going to tell you more about in the next slide. Peter is also a member of the joint working group that authored the latest version of the ISO 14971 standard, Application of Risk Management to Medical Devices. So today's webinar is a chance for you to ask Peter, the risk management expert, any questions you have on the topic. But before we dive into the presentation and I let Peter introduce himself further, let me tell you more about Medical Device HQ and how it can make you more confident in the development of your medical device. So Medical Device HQ was founded by Peter in 2008 with a vision to help as many as possible bring medical devices to the market in the most efficient way. To achieve this vision, Peter provides training courses, templates, and coaching to professionals within the medical device industry. Medical Device HQ offers fantastic resources in the form of articles, which have a great insight into all things quality related. One of the most recent articles, for example, is an illustrated guide to quality management for medical devices and ISO 13485 and is well worth the read. So courses cover a wide range of topics, ranging from risk management, which I've actually taken myself, to clinical investigations, software development, and usability engineering, to name a few. There's two options when you take the course. You can either do the entire course online or participate in a blended course which combines the online course with live virtual classes. So a link to all these courses offered by Medical Device HQ will be included in a follow-up email after the webinar. So now I'm going to hand you over to Peter to take you through our risk management presentation.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm quite delighted to be here, actually, because those of you who know me from before, you know that risk management is indeed a very dear interest of mine. So I'm looking forward to this session that we have together. And I'm going to do my best to answer as many questions as I have. I do encourage you to add questions as I go through the topics here to sort of bring up things that weren't clear or things to add on to the things that I'm going to be bringing up. So without further ado, I'm going to jump straight into the first question, which might seem like a very detailed thing, a very specific thing, but that's actually where we're going to start. One of the questions that I received was about the clinical expertise. When is a clinical expert required, and what is the definition of a clinical expert? So the first thing I want to say about this is that there is no clear requirement on what clinical expert is in the ISO 14001 or in the MDR or the IVDR. The requirement is more general when it comes to this area, saying that if you perform risk management tasks, you should be competent. So when I talk about this, I do it based on what I consider to be accepted expectations and also what can be considered to be best practices in the medical device industry. And I think the best way to explain when a clinician is needed is to look at a flowchart. And some of you have read the standard well. You have seen a similar flowchart in the standard, and it shows how a hazard leads to various events with their own individual probabilities, in this case PA and PB, as you can see here. And that in turn results in a P1, which is the probability of occurrence of the hazardous situation. And when you have estimated the probability of that hazardous situation leading to harm, that's the P2, you get to PO, which is probability of occurrence of harm. I'm sorry for turning this into a mathematics lesson, but this is in the standard, and it's very helpful when understanding what the clinical expert's role is here. So this is the typical way you would go through the estimation of the probability of occurrence of harm. So when should the clinical expert be involved? Well, here it comes. I think most cases and most risks in medical devices, you could get all the way to the hazardous situation without involvement of clinicians or clinical experts, or with very little involvement of clinicians. In my case, I've said, well, here you typically would require engineers or usability engineers or application specialists to help you out. However, when you take the step from the hazardous situation, for example, that the patient is exposed to a particular virus or bacteria, and then you turn that into harm, well, that is where you need a clinical expert or clinician, because the P2 estimation should not be done by engineers. This should be done by a clinician. And the argument for this, I think, is quite clear. You cannot expect engineers or non-clinical people to accurately estimate the probability of harm to people, or even what the harm should be. So this is definitely where you need the clinicians, both when you do the initial risk estimation as well as the residual risk estimation. When you look at this, I know one question that usually comes up here is, what shouldn't the clinicians be involved also in the sequence of events when you look at that? And you could most certainly include the clinicians there, but I think when you have a doctor or a nurse participating in the sequence of events, it's actually more because of their knowledge or expertise as application specialists, like they might know how a medical device is used in the clinic, meaning they contribute in that role instead of that particular clinical knowledge. So, but if you have those nurses or medical doctors, by all means, bring them in and let them contribute also to this process. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, part of this question was also to answer, what is the definition of clinical expert? And as I said before, to my knowledge, there is no definition of this in the medical device world, not a clear one at least. And if you have come across a definition of that term, feel free to write it in the chat. I would love to learn about that, but I have never come across that definition. But I would say that if we refer to clinical expert, or a notified body auditor would say, did you involve a clinician here or clinical expertise? I would say that a physician or medical doctor or nurse would be appropriate. There might be other types of professions, depending on the medical device type, like dentists or physiotherapists, that could also work. But to be on the safe side, a physician or medical doctor, I would say, is the safest bet when you're in an audit and this question comes up. As a side note in this question, I got another question that I wanted to bring up here. And sorry for doing a sort of a sidetrack, but when we have this flow chart up, it makes sense to discuss another thing. A few of the questions were about software and estimation of risk, and how you estimate the risk and how the results from software risk analysis can be incorporated into product risk assessments. And I know it can be a challenge, but you could also say that it's not that different, actually, because the only significant difference with software is that if software is involved in, for example, event A here, you might have heard that you should set the probability of failure of the software to 100%. That's what you need to do. So, and that the reason for that is that software fails systematically. So you cannot estimate the probability. Could you have estimated the probability of the software failure? You could have resolved the bug, basically. That's the argument. So if software is involved in event A, that would be 100%. Now, event B might not be 100%. So P1 is not always 100%, and P2 is not always 100% either. But the actual software failure will be 100%. Other than that, I would treat it the same way as any other risk management. So that, I hope, answered that question that we got on that topic. Now, there is one more sidetrack here, actually. One question here was, what is the most common approach to determine the PO, the probability of occurrence, based on the life cycle phases, or and one question, or in this question, it was also brought up if it should be relative to the numbers of units produced during manufacturing and complaints and sales data, or what should you base it on? And if I understand this question correctly, there is one thing, one very important advice I want to give to you. Now, when you do risk estimation or probabilities, what most medical advice, the way you should do that for most medical devices would be to say, what's the probability of occurrence of harm in conjunction with one single use of the medical device? That is the best way. Now, some medical device manufacturers, they say, what's the probability of occurrence of harm for the installed base that we have? Which means that it basically changes the more you sell, the more likely it will be that you have a harm on your hands. So the best way of doing this would be per use, I think. And then use any data that you have to estimate that probability or likelihood, which might be a more accurate term, actually, in some cases. So I hope that answers that question. But getting back to the clinical expert here, to summarize, when is a clinical expert required, and what is the definition of a clinical expert? Well, it's, I would say, almost always required when estimating the P2, or the probability that the hazardous situation leads to harm, and when determining the harm. And I will not provide the definition, as I said before, of what clinical expert should be, but probably a medical doctor, physician, or nurse, or something similar, then you should be on the safe side. If you have other professions that you consider to have the clinical expertise, feel free to add that to the chat. I would love to hear about that if you have some other profession that you think makes sense. So feel free to share that. And that means we've covered the first question with a few built into this first question. And I'm going to move to the next question, which was, what is the relevance of the ISO 31000 risk management standard in the medical device industry? Now, for those of you who don't know, ISO 31000 is a standard which is titled Guidelines or Risk Management Guidelines, and it provides principles, a framework, and a process for managing risk. Now, ISO, the ISO organization, says that this can be used by any organization, regardless of its size, activity, or sector. That's quite a bold statement. But the question now is, can it? And we'll see in a second, but first the sidetrack again. What you see here on screen is the ISO 31000 on the Estonian Standardization Institute's website. And you can find that on evs.ee, evs.ee. And why am I showing you this particular one? Well, because the price of this standard is 13 euros on this website. What do you think this one costs on other sources? Well, the Swedish or Danish standardization institutes, they charge about 10 times more. So my advice to you, whenever you're going to buy a standard, check the price on evs.ee. Just make sure to buy the English version if that's your language, not the Estonian one. That won't make much sense, unfortunately, for most of us, I believe. But it's super cheap. It's the same standard. It's just the front page that has a different language. That's a really nice tip, I think. Getting back to the ISO 31000 standard, what about it? Well, there is one fundamental difference between ISO 49071 and the ISO 31000 standards, and that is the definition of risk. The ISO 49071 definition of risk is about product safety and is therefore concerned with harm. A typical example would be that a patient or user is injured by a medical device in one way or another. But the ISO 31000 standard has a much broader definition. It speaks about the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And not only that, it actually also brings up positive risk or opportunities, to use another word. So even though risk management, according to ISO 31000, also includes positive effects, this is something that few are aware of or utilize, other than when they perform like a basic SWOT analysis or something like that, where opportunities would be the O in the SWOT. And getting back then to objectives, what would that be? Well, in the context of ISO 31000, it could be almost anything relating to the performance of the company. It could be to reach a certain sales goals or a certain profit or milestone. And things that could impact that would be the loss of key personnel or the currency exchange rate changes or anything like that impacts you. And these are all things that could impact your objectives, obviously. Now, you should avoid mixing these two concepts up. And here I'm getting to the answer slowly. Now, I sometimes refer to risk management when we talk about ISO 14971 risk management as product safety risk management. And then I call the risk management that is done in accordance with the requirements of ISO 31000 corporate or project risk management. That's a quite good way, I think, of making a difference between them. The problem is that sometimes people that are not that experienced in risk management in the medical device industry, they mix these two concepts up. So you shouldn't make that mistake. You should never find a risk as it's defined in ISO 31000 in your ISO 14971 risk management file. However, you can actually find a product safety risk in your project risk list according to ISO 31000. Because let's say that you are waiting for some results on or risk estimates, which relates to probability of occurrence of harm. And if you learn that those estimates or that risk or magnitude of risk is really high, that might require a design change, and that could delay your project. Thus, that becomes a project risk. So it could be that a missing or uncertain product risk is a project risk, but not the other way around usually. Now, there is one pitfall that I would like to bring up here in this context, and that is that the medical device industry, we tend to be so obsessed with product safety risk management that the corporate or project risk management is completely overshadowed and neglected. And this means that we miss out on the benefits of implementing good project risk management, which could lead to delays and cost overruns. So do not let the product safety risk management completely take all the time from all the risk management you're planning on doing. Both these two types of risk management are important. So I would say that the statement from ISO about ISO 31000 makes sense, and any sector can apply the principles of ISO 31000. Just don't try to use the definition of risk from the ISO 31000 in your ISO 14971 product safety risk management file. And don't mix ISO 14971 risk management with ISO 31000 risk management. That's not a good idea. So to answer the question, it's very relevant, but not for product safety risk management. Keep that in mind. Yes, that was another big question. Now, next up, a heavy one. And I have a feeling that a lot of you are in this area and that this will be relevant to you. A lot of the questions are touching upon the topic of FMEA, which is interesting and sometimes challenging and even a little bit controversial. So I'm going to try to answer when you should use FMEA in the risk management process. And let's see here what you say about this. It's going to be interesting. So if we take a look into the ISO 14971, what is risk management according to that standard? Well, it's the systematic application of management policies, procedures, and practices to the tasks of analyzing, evaluating, controlling, and monitoring risk. Not very tangible. I hate to say it. That's the definition, though. If we take a look at it from a more visual point of view, what you are required to have is a process that includes risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk control, production and post-production activities that will address risks, all risks actually, from all the life cycle phases. And you see examples of the life cycle phases here. Yours might be different depending on the nature of the product, but these are quite typical, ranging from initial conception until final decommissioning. So this is what you need to do according to ISO 14971. Now, what about FMEA? There is another definition of that. And here I'm going to be using the definition from the a standard which is on FMEA, and that is IEC 60812. And the definition here is a systematic method. Both definitions include the word systematic. Method of evaluating an item or process to identify the ways in which it might potentially fail, and that's probably where you have that failure mode thing, and the effects of the mode of failure upon the performance of the item or process and on the surrounding environment and personnel. That's the definition. Now, if we are taking a look at this definition, is maybe not yet crystal clear what this is and how these things are different. So let me show you a table which I think shows quite typical product safety risk management according to ISO 14901. And the reason why I say this is quite typical is because you can see it starts with hazard, sequence of events, hazardous situation, harm. Basically, these are the headings of all the sections, not all of them, but from section or chapter 4 going forward in the standard. So this would be all the things you need to do to meet the requirements of ISO 14901 when it comes to risk assessment and risk control. And having a table that is this similar to the standard is great because there's no confusion which requirement is met where. Now, if we add a typical FMEA table, it could look something like this. Now, you might be saying, well, that's not how we do FMEA. In fact, some companies, they actually do risk management according to ISO 14901, and they just refer to it as FMEA. I don't like that because if there is a standard that describes what FMEA is, I think we should be using that definition and stick to that. Otherwise, it gets very confusing. But if you turn to the IEC 60812, this would be quite typical FMEA. You can see there are some similarities like PO and S, and that's not so strange that it's mixed up. But there are still some very fundamental and important differences between the two. And one of the main differences is that ISO 14901 risk management starts with hazards, whereas the FMEA starts with looking at a part or a process step and how it can fail. And that's one of the big differences here. Now, having said this, that lots of companies are actually using both and some just one of them, I would love to hear more in the chat if you use ISO 14901 product risk management or product safety risk management, or is it an FMEA you use, or maybe both? Would be super interesting to hear. So feel free to write up a note about that, and we can see if Lola can feed some information back to us later on that topic. But continuing here on the differences, or actually there was one more question now that it comes to mind. There was a question about IVD and risk management for IVDs, in vitro diagnostic medical devices, and the question was relating to detectability, and the RPN number was brought up, and are there options for this? And you can see RPN, risk priority number, is a typical FMEA concept. Not only that, it's quite an old FMEA concept. More modern FMEA would be more likely to evaluate the risks with a system similar to what we have in ISO 14901, meaning you have PO and S, probability of occurrence of harm, and severity. So I would actually not recommend using RPN. I would go with the PO and S, and there are multiple reasons for it. One is obviously that it's in the ISO 14901 standard, which is both harmonized as well as a recognized consensus standard, meaning it is the expectation of European as well as US authorities or agencies to comply with. So I hope that answers the IVD question that was mentioned here to me before. So if we go back to risk management versus FMEA, we spoke about this. ISO 14901 starts with hazards, FMEA with parts or process steps. ISO 14901 covers all the risks, and FMEA actually aims to improve the reliability. And it only addresses fault conditions, not risks from normal use. And the normal use is interesting because that's typically where we get our side effects or after effects, which we need to be aware of in the medical device industry and identify and disclose in the disclosure of residual risk. So that's an important aspect that you will miss out on completely if you only do FMEA. But what do these things mean? Well, let's take a look and try to put ISO 14901, product safety risk management, put that into the context of FMEA, or the other way around for that matter. So if you have ISO 14901 risk management, the purpose is to prevent harm. That's what we're after here. But FMEA tries to prevent the product from failing and improve the reliability. Now, sometimes a failing product can lead to harm, to no surprise. If you have a pacemaker or a ventilator or a defibrillator that fails to deliver a shock, well, that failure will result in harm. There are also harmless stops, like a digital thermometer, where you can't measure your temperature, or a patient bed that you cannot elevate. None of those will result in harm. They are going to result in annoyed customer and maybe warranty case, but not a harm. What you need to do is to make sure that if you have a medical device where the failure leads to harm, you need to feed that information into your product safety risk management process so that the overall residual risk is estimated properly and it's handled the way it should according to ISO 14971. So you need to connect the two, and there's actually a lot of issues in that area, to be honest. And so now we basically have the answer to when should you be using FMEA. Well, if the safety of your device depends on the reliability and function, it's a good idea to use FMEA. It would be the case when you, for example, develop a pacemaker. And in the 60601 standard, there is something called essential performance, which is relevant to mention here. What that basically means in layperson's terms is that if you lose a function and if the risk is then unacceptable, if you lose that function, well, that is essential performance. And if you have essential performance in your product, well, then it makes perfect sense to try to improve the reliability and therefore to do FMEA. It's a great tool for that. There is one more situation, and that is if you're a contract manufacturer and you don't have the necessary information to estimate the risk, or you might not even know what the hazard situation would be because you don't know the clinical consequences of a failure or a fault. Well, I regret to say that it's quite common that contract manufacturers are never given that information. So they can look at deviations from the spec, but do not know what harm it will cause. And the problem with that is obviously that the priorities and risk evaluation might be completely off. This even happens sometimes with internal production where the production department never gets that information. So if you are in production and you do not get that information on the clinical consequences of various failures or hazardous situations, then FMEA is a good fallback position. However, that obviously then assumes that someone picks up on the results from the FMEA in the ISO 14971 product safety risk management process, so that those risks are also found there. So, when should you use FMEA in the risk management process? When the safety of the medical device depends on reliability, or if you have essential performance, makes perfect sense. It's not required though, but it makes sense. If you're a contract manufacturer and you don't have information on the clinical consequences of failures, it also makes perfect sense to use FMEA, because then you can at least do something. Yes, so that is a potentially controversial topic. I'm hoping that we are going to get some feedback on that, and I can see there's lots of questions coming up here. There are some here. I'm going to save some of them, but let me see here. And I believe examples, one of the questions here is from Tanas, is when can we get some examples when it's better to use FMEA or risk assessment based on ISO 14971? Well, there is actually a quite simple answer to that question. You have to use ISO 14971 risk management. FMEA is optional. So there is really no, at least if you use the meaning and definition as I provided here from ISO 14971 and FMEA standard, you have to do ISO 14971 risk management. It's optional with FMEA. So it's an add-on. It's a tool that you can use. And I think that answers the question. Yes. Good. Thank you very much for that question. Now I'm going to move forward a little bit here and bring up another question here that was sent to us beforehand. Oh, by the way, there is one more thing I want to say. There is an article on Medical Device HQ about FMEA, and actually there are several articles. There is also a series of articles about splitting up, which is common in FMEA, like design FMEA, use FMEA, and process FMEA, and the risks of doing that. One should keep in mind that ISO 14971 requires you to look at combination of events, not just single faults. And FMEA is a single fault technique. It will only look at one error and what that will lead to. but we are required to take a broader approach and look at combinations, which is important. So I recommend to take a look at that. The FMEA article, I believe we can link here in the webinar. When it comes to this article series, The Danger of Division, as I call it, there will be a link sent to you after the webinar where there's more to read on that if you're interested in that. Yes, next question. What are the most common mistakes in risk management? And I've added that no one talks about yet, because there is a super common mistake and very few people talk about it. In fact, you're likely to get through an audit with making this mistake anyway, but I'm going to tell you about it because I think it's going to be more and more important in the future. And to talk about this, we're going to use a patient lift as an example. To charge the battery of this patient lift, there is a 230-volt cable that you put into the device and connect to the wall outlet. And in this case, the insulation has been removed, and user touches the live cables inside and is exposed to 230 volts of alternating current. And that's obviously not a good thing. So I've written up this here in a risk analysis, and I'm saying that the hazardous situation is user is exposed to electricity and the harm is electrocution. Now, I want you to get involved in this a little bit because I want to ask you, what do you think the severity of this risk should be? And I've added, let me see here, I've added the definitions here. So you have the, here you have the definitions ranging from 1 to 5, inconvenience or temporary discomfort, all the way to death. So I would love to hear from you. What do you think? Is it a 5? Is it a 4, 3?
Getting 5s and 4s in here so far.
Yeah.
Lots
Okay.
of 4s, yeah.
We have both. Do you have a majority vote? Is there more 5 or more 4?
More 4s.
Yeah. Okay. And 4 is probably more common, I would say. So I think this is in line with my expectations here. I think we can also probably agree that people can die from this, right? It happens. It's not common. You can touch a cable oftentimes, but it's not something I recommend. Don't get me wrong, but it could lead to death. It could also be for sure. So, but now we are getting to the most common mistake, and let me now try to show you what I mean, because I think we can all agree that both 4 and 5 are possible. Now let's get to it here. I'm saying that most hazard situations have a range of harms with different severities, but we tend to treat them as if there was only one outcome for every hazardous situation. And this is the problem. This is the problem. I believe that the true representation of this risk and the probabilities would be something more like this. We have some people with really thick skin, completely dry hands, rubber shoes, not touching anything else, touching the cable. They would feel it. Maybe it's 1 or 2. We have those more normal that it's significantly painful, but nothing more happens. 4, that would be the ones that have to get resuscitated with a defibrillator or get an atrial fibrillation and needs to go to the hospital to have a check. And 5, the unfortunate ones that would actually die. And I think we could say that all of these things could happen as the result of this hazardous situation. But what severity should we then use? We should not use the average, I can tell you that much. That would be completely inappropriate. But maybe we should be using all the different severities, because I believe that you would find that we have different probabilities for them. Maybe it's 1% that has that really, really thick skin. That wouldn't be so, I mean, it's maybe a little bit unrealistic. I should add, I'm not a clinical expert that we talked about before, so I've been doing quite much of guesstimates on these ones, but it shows you the principle. And I believe that we have these different percentages on the different harms. And I believe this one is around about 1 in 1,000, I think, that would die from that kind of accident, as far as I can tell. But what if you, like most organizations do, just recorded the 0.1% or maybe the 20% here? Because most of you wrote 4 or 5. Well, what you're effectively doing is that you ignore, if you went with 5, you ignore the rest of the outcomes. So you had the poor 20% that had to go to the hospital and have their heart checked or even were resuscitated. We just ignored them. I think that's a problem, because your overall residual risk evaluation will be completely incorrect as a result of that, right? You are just discarding a huge group of patients that have serious problems with this product when they're electrocuted, and we pretend like they don't exist. Now, if you went with 4 instead, don't pat yourself on the shoulder too much, because what you're doing then is this. You're ignoring the ones that die. And this happens. I had a company contacting me saying, "Oh, Peter, we have this great problem. One of our patients had an adverse event and actually died, but we wrote 4 on the severity in our table. What should we do?" And the problem is that they had only room for 1 row for each hazardous situation. That was the only way they could work. And obviously, the death was true. So should they change it to 5? Well, it was extremely rare on the same time. Well, the solution is obviously to include them all. That would be more appropriate and provide a more true picture. Now, this might be a little bit terrifying. You can see yourself expanding your risk tables here with a factor of 5 if you include all harms and severities for all risks. Am I just making life difficult for you now? Or is there any support of this in the standards? And actually there is. If you take a look in the ISO TR 24970, I know it's not the standard, but it's sort of a very trustworthy guidance. And you can see here what it says. This is the second half of 547, where it's stated that the hazard situation can lead to different kinds of harm. The P2 can have different values. And at the end, it concludes that several scenarios can be relevant, not only those with the highest severity of harm or with the highest probability of occurrence of harm. Other scenarios can also be relevant. And the manufacturer should consider what the best manner is to document the hazardous situation, describing, look at that, 1 or more sequences of events that can lead to this hazardous situation and the different kinds of harm that can occur. So it's in there. It's in there for sure. So documenting more than 1 row for each risk is rare. Not many companies would do that, but I think a lot more companies should. And there are multiple ways you can do it. One is obviously to just add more rows. Another one is to use columns, and there's a lot to be said about that. So for a short webinar like this, I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but I want you to reflect on this because one thing that happens a lot is that people sit and have arguments about this. Like if I were to lock you in a room and say, what's the severity of this electrical shock? And I would lock you in the room for 20 minutes and see if you could agree whether it would be 4 or 5. I bet you would come out and say it's 4.6. And the reason for that is that people are arguing in the risk management workshops. Is it 4? No, it's 5. No, I don't agree. It should be 4. Where in fact, they're just talking about 2 different entries in the risk management table or hazard trace matrix. So understanding this can help you reduce friction in your risk management workshops, which is important, by the way, to do. So I want to open your mind to this here. If you are already working with multiple severities, I would love to hear that in the chat. And Lola, you will be following up, I'm sure. Like if you say, yeah, we can address multiple severities for and harms for one hazardous situation, would be super cool to hear. I know some larger companies do it. I do it always when I work with risk management nowadays, but far from everyone are doing this. So, having said that, what are the most common mistakes in risk management? I would say it's to include only 1 harm, 1 PO, and 1 severity for each hazardous situation, where in fact we know that most hazardous situations will in fact have multiple outcomes with different probabilities and different severities. That would be the most common mistake I see by far. Yeah, I think that's a super interesting perspective. Lola, do you have anything to report? People have commented on this here. Are there any questions or comments?
I was taking note of those who do ISO 14971 risk management or FMEA or both. So we actually had a pretty even split between both. Some using one, some using the other, a smaller number actually doing the 2 together. And other than that, we've had a few questions coming in about that. One question I copied in from the chat is, where do we draw the line in the assessment of severity? Often including multiple severities has caused the risk assessment to be too long and not usable.
Yeah, yeah. There, obviously, you need to find an administrative way of documenting this in an appropriate way, and I think I regret to say that we won't be able to show any pictures of how it can be done during this webinar. I could spend a dedicated webinar on that, I believe. to do that. As at least, if I understand the question correctly, it would be to go down a road that we won't have time for, unfortunately. But it's a good question in the sense that a lot of people are struggling with this, where to draw the line. It's a common issue to know where to stop in several ways. Both in terms of how far you should go in terms of consequences, but also how low or how small and insignificant risks should you include. And I think the only good advice to give there is to apply as much common sense as you can, to not go overboard. There is no point in having 10,000 of rows or 10,000 rows in your tables. That will probably not make anyone happy.
Perfect. Thanks for answering that, Peter.
I hope that's a little bit answer in that direction. Have you received anything more on the multiple severities, or are there no comments relating to
that? Just checking the chat. Not yet. I will let you know. Yeah, I have somebody said they only document the one. They like your approach, but they only document the one outcome.
Yeah. But I'm hoping that you will be able to see how limited this is, and that you might have, 10% on 5, 10% on 4, 10% on 3. And if you select one, you're just ignoring a whole bunch of quite severe risks or outcomes. So that's my key takeaway on that part. I have also received one question here. As a contract manufacturer, when performing process FMEA, do we investigate the risk of failing the safety of the final device or the component we are producing? Well, if you get the information, like the clinical situation and consequences of the various failures, you could be doing a real product safety risk management on the final device. You would say, well, if we fail on our power supply or whatever it might be, it's going to have the following consequence on the top level. However, it's quite uncommon that you can do that because usually the production department won't have the clinical expertise. So then you would look at more the component you're producing or the subsystem you're producing. And then the manufacturer that has the whole picture would bring that information in and address it in the product safety risk management file. That would be my suggestion there, or reflection. Okay, I have one or two more questions that I prepared, so I'm going to continue moving. But Lola, you can catch up with me in the next before the next question, I believe. One question here is, should all warnings stem from risk analysis? And this here also is one very, very common mistake. So stay tuned for this one here. Now, in order to get through this here, we should talk about risk control options. And there are 3 risk control options in ISO 14901. It's inherently safe design and manufacture, protective measures in the medical device itself or in the manufacturing process, and lastly, information for safety and, where appropriate, training to users. And now that we have spoken about mistakes, let me bring up 2 more. Firstly, some people still believe that information for safety cannot reduce the risk. It most certainly can. It's not effective. It's the least effective of these 3 risk control options, but it does reduce risk, or it can reduce risk, and it is a viable risk control option. Now, you might want to avoid it because it's really difficult to prove that it reduces risk, but it still can, so it is a risk control option. And secondly, if you change the design of the medical device to reduce the risk, that does not automatically mean that you are going with this first option, inherently safe design and manufacture. A lot of people get this wrong. I say that if you apply a protective measure, let's say an alarm or a cover, that is also, or it is a protective measure, right? A cover or an alarm, they are protective measures. They are also changes to the design. I would even argue that if you put a sticker on the product, that's information for safety, like don't touch or do this before you use it. That's also changed to the design. So to determine which risk control option it is, you need to think about the way by which you change the design. And in the first case, it's more or less the complete removal of the hazard. Here you prevent exposure to the hazard, and information for safety, you try to convince the user of not doing silly things or avoid certain things that puts them in a hazardous situation. Having said that, let's get back to the question on information for safety and whether everything needs to stem from the risk analysis. Now here, the key to unlocking this thing here is to look at examples of information for safety. And this comes from ISO TR 24971, the guidance document. And it says that placing warnings on the medical device, that's one information for safety, including contraindications in the accompanying documentation. And the third one is the most interesting one, providing instructions for use to support correct use and to avoid use error. This means that if you state important things in the instructions for use, and they might not be warnings, but you say, oh, this is important that you do, those statements are information for safety. So anything you say where if you do not comply with it or conform to it results in harm, it is information for safety. And information for safety is a risk control measure. And there is another interesting requirement in ISO 14901 that says that you need to identify the hazards and hazardous situations. And the short version of this is that you need to identify all hazards and hazardous situations and the associated risk control measures, which means that if you have something in the IFU which says, well, it's important that you do this, and and the underlying cause is because if you don't, there's going to be a problem or harm, well, that must be found also in your risk analysis and risk control section of your hazard traceability matrix, or whatever we call it. Now, if you do not include it here, but you write it here, well, then you fail to identify all the hazardous situations. So then you're missing out on that requirement. And if you write it here and you don't have it in the IFU, well, then that's the other way around. You have identified the risk, but you didn't do the risk control measures. So you need to have both. And that is true for anything where if you don't follow the instruction or information, it results in harm. If you want to prove that this information is effective, keep in mind that this is most often done in your summative evaluation or human factors validation as part of the usability engineering process. So that's a good place to include that always, basically. And it's perfectly valid or legitimate for an auditor to look in the instructions for use and say, look, here you're saying that you have to do this and that because that's important for whatever reason. What happens if you don't? And then you're going to say, well, if you don't do that, then this bad thing is going to happen. And then going back to the hazard traceability matrix and check that that has been identified, that's perfectly valid to do. And in fact, I would encourage auditors to do it because there's supposed to be a link between the two. What about precautions then? Because this is a subset of this question. Precautions are usually there to prevent damage to the medical device. You say there might not be harm in the sense that it's to people, but you could ruin the device or something like that. Well, harm as it's defined in ISO 14901 actually does include both people, any people, not just the patient, property, and the environment. So if the medical device is ruined because the user did not take the necessary precautions, it can still be seen as within the scope of ISO 14901 risk management. But then again, that kind of harm, most auditors are not that interested in it. If you have a product that breaks down and you can't use it, usually not that interesting. The focus is on people. But strictly speaking, I would argue that also precautions that are there to protect property should be in your hazard traceability matrix, strictly speaking. So to answer the question, should all warnings stem from risk analysis? Absolutely. Not only the warnings, but all the information for safety should come from the risk analysis or risk control section, maybe we should say. Because first in the risk analysis, you would identify the risk, and then you would say, this is the risk control measure, which is to include information for safety in the instructions for use or on the product for that matter. So I hope that answers that question. Lola, do you have anything you would like to report to me now?
No, everything's going great. Everything's going great. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, good, good. So I am moving into this is a heavy one. This is for all the nerds in this webinar. Do you have to reduce the risk as far as possible? And I've received a few questions about this. It's a challenging topic because the ones that wrote the MDR weren't so lucky when they did it. There's a lot of ambiguities and unclear things in the MDR or IVDR. And I say this not to depress you. I'm saying this because if you read it and you struggle understanding what's meant, you're normal. That can be good to know. So, do you have to reduce the risk as far as possible? Let's bring that up. In the MDR, there are no less than 7 different terms or phrases for this reduce as far as possible, unfortunately. But that's how they reason it. And there is a clause 2 in the standard, in the in the MDR and IVDR. Clause 2 says that the requirement in this annex to reduce risks as far as possible means the reduction of risks as far as possible without adversely affecting the benefit risk ratio. Where does this come from? Well, if we take a look at a defibrillator, you send an electric shock through the patient's chest when they suffer from cardiac arrest to resuscitate the heart. Putting 360 joules of electric shock through the chest is potentially harmful. The patient could get burns and the heart muscle could be injured. So if we were to only reduce the risk as far as possible, which is actually what the MDD said, it just said you have to reduce the risk as far as possible. And MDD is the Medical Device Directive. What would you do? Well, you would bring down the electrical energy to maybe 5 or 10 joules. That is basically harmless. It's also completely useless in a defibrillator because you would not resuscitate any hearts. So the Medical Device Directive was, well, pretty bad in that sense because it basically said make the medical device ineffective. So therefore, in the MDRs, I'm almost smart enough to say, well, that wording wasn't perfect. So let's say that you should find that balance by reducing the risk as far as possible without adversely affecting the benefit risk ratio. So you want to bring down the energy so that you can still successfully resuscitate the patient while not risking the patient's health at the same time. And this makes perfect sense, I think. So it's a pretty good thing. What does the ISO 14901 say about this? Well, it doesn't specifically require you to reduce risk as far as possible. In fact, it does not at all specify what magnitude of risk constitutes acceptable or unacceptable. On the other hand, it just says that you need to have a policy that is going to be the basis for you to decide what is acceptable and unacceptable risk. So you could look at any regulatory requirements and bring them in and say, this is what we have decided. So from that point of view, it's not counter to what the MDR says. It's the umbrella that you can use here, the ISO 14901. So you should base this policy on relevant international standards or national or regional regulations, like the MDR, IVDR. And there is a number of other factors you should take into account. And if you then try to comply with the MDR and IVDR, you should reduce the risk as far as possible without adversely affecting the benefit risk ratio. And then you need to take that into the risk management plan. There is actually a article. One of the questions we got was about the risk management or risk policy or the policy for establishing criteria for risk acceptability. And I've written a blog post about that. There is an article on Medical Device HQ about that. So if you are the one asking that question, look out for that link that will take you to that article that answers your question. So the consequence of this requirement here is that if you're planning to sell to the EU, you need to include this thinking or statement in your policy. And it should then be found in your risk management plan as well. Now, most companies would still do risk evaluation using a matrix like this, which looks at the magnitude of risk. But the MDR says you need to reduce it as far as possible, which is more of a relative measure. It's not absolute. So in theory, you could have a risk with a magnitude 5.5, you would be down here, and you managed to bring it down just a little bit down to here, and then you couldn't bring it further down without adversely affecting the benefit risk ratio. So now this, by definition, according to the MDR, is acceptable because the MDR doesn't mention magnitude of risk. But if you are used to using a risk evaluation matrix, you might rightfully wonder, how can this risk, which is fairly high, right, be acceptable? We did reduce it as far as we could, but we couldn't go any further without adversely affecting the benefit risk ratio. Should this be acceptable? And probably not. Because from an ISO 14901 point of view, it would say that if it's unacceptable, you need to do a benefit risk analysis. And for the MDR, we are saying that you need to do that every time you have a risk. You should, because otherwise you couldn't determine when you stop reducing it. But so if we were to work according to MDR only, you could, in theory, throw out the risk evaluation matrix and stop thinking of risks in terms of magnitude. I think that's a wrong decision, though, because that would create a lot of problems in relation to other standards. Because most medical device standards, when they talk about acceptable and unacceptable risk, they would refer to a matrix like this. That's the underlying assumption. So if you have a risk up here, that's not going to be, other standards would not appreciate having that as an acceptable standard just because you brought it down as far as you could. So I think what you should do is to have both criteria. you would say, can I bring it down, or did I bring it down as far as I could? And where did I end up in this evaluation matrix? And if both those two, you brought it down as far as you could and you're in the green, you're good to go. The risk is acceptable. Now, how do you document this? That's a very common question. Let's look at a few examples. Now here, I have included in my table that I check the magnitude of risk, which is a traditional risk evaluation matrix, and then I check whether I reduced it as far as possible without adversely affecting the benefit-risk ratio. And in this case, I concluded that both, yes, it was acceptable from magnitude point of view, and we did it as far as we could. So therefore, I say this is acceptable. But what if we have then another case here where the magnitude of risk is acceptable, but we could not reduce it as far as we could? Well, then it's unacceptable, right? Because both criteria should be met. And if it's no here, but yes here on the as far as possible, we get another situation. It's actually acceptable because we have, from the MDR point of view, it's acceptable. And we've done our benefit risk analysis when it comes to the magnitude. And hopefully then we get to the result that this can be accepted. It could be debated a little bit whether benefit risk analysis that is favorable results in acceptable or unacceptable, but that's for another session, I believe. Now, one question here is, how much do you need to document about this here? And I have found that practices vary a lot. Is it enough to say yes? I hope it is in most cases, but you could say, no, we're just doing it. We don't say it. You could have yes, no, you could have a short text, or you could have a numerical rationale. I would not recommend you to try to quantify this. It's a very slippery slope and super difficult to do. So don't go down that road. A short rationale might do the job, and write it almost like a standardized thing that you use on most of the risks. And then if you have something where it really matters, like should we have 360 joules in the defibrillator or 300, and you look at really the science behind it, write a lot more. That's perfectly valid, justified, and value adding. So I would adjust it a little bit to the situation, actually. Sometimes you can group it and say all electrical risks, you do one risk benefit analysis for those. Sometimes you do it on an individual level. That's really depending a lot on what your reviewers are used to seeing and what they require from you. There is nothing specific on this in the MDR or in the ISO 14971. So you need to go as far as you think is value adding and where you do not get into trouble with your technical reviewers. Have your notified body required or expressed requirements in this area? Let me know in the chat. That would be super interesting to know. If they said, no, we need to write for each and every row, they said that was necessary, or you just did a yes, no, or a short rationale. I would love to hear about that in the chat. So type there if you can, or that would be super nice. So do you have to reduce the risk as far as possible? Yes, as long as it does not adversely affect the benefit risk ratio. And it does apply to all risks that you identify, for sure. That was what I had prepared in terms of presentation. We've managed to squeeze in one or two questions in between. Lola, let me take a look here if there's anything high priority that we should be trying to address here.
Perfect. And in the chat, we just have a few people saying that the notified body is indicating that they expect a statement on each row, regardless of acceptability. So that seems to be the trend there.
Yeah. And that is unfortunate, I think, because what if you have a risk where you say, well, you could drop the medical device on your foot? It is not meaningful to write about that, to be honest. I hope that the notified bodies will be very sort of forgiving in that when you write about, well, we have a medical device, that's the benefit. The risk is that we drop it on our foot. So if you ask me, it's in many cases a complete waste of time, but that's where we are.
Perfect. I know we're coming close to time. Peter, I don't know if there was one question that stood out to you there that you wanted to answer beforehand, but if not, I think it's wise that we would wrap up the presentation and we'll work on addressing the remaining questions after the webinar.
Yes, we should do that. And I would be super happy if participants would connect with me on LinkedIn. Look me up. I think the link has been here in the webinar before, but if not, look for Peter Sebelius, and I will be happy to connect with anyone who is interested in risk management. It's a dear interest of mine, obviously. And Lola, I think we should also mention that we got such big interest here that we are considering having another session again if there is an interest. So feel free to indicate that in the chat if you would like us to run a similar event later on, and which topics or questions would be interesting to bring up then. I believe there is also a link, right, to submit your interest in participating in another webinar event like this. And that's basically all I had. I'm just hoping that as many as possible will connect with me on LinkedIn.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you for everyone for participating in all the questions that you sent in. I hope you've all learned something new from today. Again, I'll just reiterate that the session is recorded. It'll be emailed to you soon with lots of extra useful resources, including the link to the Medical Device HQ courses and a short survey just to get your feedback on how you found this session, which we'd really appreciate you completing. Again, thank you, Peter, for your time and answering your questions. And we hope to see you again soon in a future webinar.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.